Hello everybody, welcome to the first Cutthroat Commander deck tech. I decided to start off with Animar, Soul of Elements, and no, not because it's alphabetical. This is the deck I've probably played more games than any other. There are a few people that play it on Magic Online. It's very straightforward, it's easy to explain, so it's kind of a good beginner's deck to get into the format. It's not necessarily my most powerful, but it is my favorite, and it at least has ways to deal with a lot of the other common decks. There are certainly bad matchups to it, but you'll find any deck that you play online in this format will have some bad matchups that you have to get really lucky to beat. Um, there are many different ways to build this deck, and they're not wrong. It's a matter of personal preference. I've seen people build Hydra, like all Hydra versions of this. I've seen people build Morph. I've even tried to build the Morph one. I'm not very good at that one. It feels a little underpowered, but it's certainly very synergistic. But this is kind of my standard stock list. It gets tinkered with constantly. Cards phase in and out. There's cards not on here. If it seems like an obvious card for Animar, I've probably had it in here or out. But, you know, you can only play 99 other cards, and these are what I've chosen. I'm going to start from right to left. Starting off with the mana base, it's not sorted in any particular order other than it's in two columns to avoid going off the end of the screen. The mana base, it goes without saying that this deck is super mana and super color intensive. The first few turns, having the right color of mana is very important. Obviously, Animar requires you to have all three colors on turn 3. And then if you look at the rest of the list, you have some very color-intensive requirements. Trying to cast Eternal Witness or Soul of the Harvest, followed by Prime Speaker, followed by Inferno Titan, followed by Magus of the Future. Those, you know, sometimes even with seemingly perfect mana fixing, things can get a little out of hand. So if you look at the mana base, I do not play a lot of utility lands, and it's important that the utility lands I do play produce colored mana. So for instance, what I play as utility? Mosswort Bridge, that's a common inclusion, and getting 10 power in this deck is relatively straightforward. You know, the temples are great additions to Commander. Cavern of Souls obviously is important in this format since blue is by far probably the most popular color. Other than that, really the only other utility land I play, the only colorless land I play is Strip Mine. You can play Wasteland. There's a couple reasons to play Strip Mine. Obviously, it's a strict upgrade over Wasteland. 2, Wasteland is, I have one, but it's, you know, for other players out there, it's stupid expensive on Magic Online compared to Strip Mine. And then 3, there are corner cases, you know, things where people start stacking Fertile Ground type effects on basic lands thinking, you know, they're much more resilient. So it's important to be able to take those things out. Underworld Connections is something you see from time to time. And then finally, people who are smart tend to leave up basic lands when they hold up counter magic or things like that. And honestly, one of the most common uses of Strip Mine that I find myself using as I play more and more is waiting until the end of turn, on their turn, when they leave up their 2 islands or whatever, and using Strip Mine to keep them off counter magic mana to force through an important spell. Other colorless lands I've had in here in the past, Wasteland, obviously I've had, you know, sometimes gone up to that second copy, and Homeward Path is something that comes in and out of this deck fairly often. So many steal effects, so many reanimate out of your graveyard effects, bribery, things like that. There's nothing more backbreaking than somebody bribing an Eldrazi out of your deck and then just dropping Homeward Path and getting it back. But that's the mana base. Next to that, you have the mana rocks. In your turns after you cast Animar, you rarely want to be casting anything but creatures. So most of the mana rocks I play are the ones you can cast turn 1, the most busted of them. Mox Diamond, of course, helps you play turn 2 Animar. Things like Coalition Relic and Gilded Lotus are good cards, but they're just not really what this deck wants. You don't need to ramp up from 3 to 6 or from 5 to 9 when your commander is ramping up to your creature spells. If you look at the non-creature spells, nothing costs, 5, 6, 7 mana except for Cyclonic Rift. So those are important. And also, like, even though they're colorless and this deck doesn't do a lot with colorless mana, just getting a fast start is so important in this format. Next to that, you have Eldrazi. Some people don't like Eldrazi and they complain about them, but they serve a lot of important purposes. One is inevitability. There's something, they trump almost everything that another deck will throw at you. Two, there are more mill decks than you think online. I've played against Phenax a few times. I've played against other decks like that, and having kind of an out to that is important. They have some other niche uses, like Ulamog is one of the few ways to bust through problematic permanents through heavy counter magic or through something like Humility. And then finally, they're great to shuffle off Survival to Fittest. And obviously, the dream is you cast these for free off a huge Animar. And then finally, like, sometimes Annihilator is annoying, certainly. Other times, it's really the only way you can start cutting through the morass when people have these prison-like board states. Next to that, the next two columns are just value creatures. If you've ever played a value creature kind of deck, none of these will be that surprising. Cards like Prophet of Kruphix and Maelstrom Wanderer are just objectively powerful cards that gain you a ton of value. The Cloud of Fairies, Peridot Drake kind of cards and Animar act as kind of dark rituals and can allow for some ridiculously busted turns. I do have Palinchron in here. I would still play it probably, even if it didn't allow you to go infinite. But for most of the time, like by the time you can go infinite with it, usually have other ways to win. I rarely use that to just kind of one-shot the opponent with Animar. Other things in here are just, Value Town, Breck Sage, Glenelander Archmage, Clone Effects, Flametongue Kavu, Fierce Empath, Imperial Recruiter, Genesis. It's a little slow, but sometimes there are matchups, particularly against like what I will call Jund-like commander decks, where it becomes just this huge grind, and that can kind of be a trump, especially when you're sitting there with 10 lands in play, and both people are top decking and tossing removal around. So it's come in and out, but right now it's in. The next column are cards that are not necessarily value creatures so much as designed to combat specific things. Loaming Shaman, obviously graveyard decks. Gilded Drake is one of the only cheap creatures that can interact with other cheap commanders. There are a lot of cheap commanders out there that do not give you a lot of time to react. Zur and Kalia come to mind. This deck doesn't really play things like Lightning Bolt, so taking that commander is often, for 2 mana, is often the cheapest play you can make. Teferi is super important. Obviously, there are annoying decks out there with counter magic, but he also plays a huge role against some decks that can be very hard to interact with. I'm looking at you, Maelstrom Wanderer and Jwara the Gitu. There's nothing better than to Cavern of Souls, end of turn, a Teferi, right as the suspend counters are coming off Jwara's ridiculousness, or stopping Maelstrom Wanderer from just completely going off. Keteric Leviathan is kind of a way to force through a board reset. There's all sorts of shenanigans you can do with it as well if you have like a Prophet of Kruphix or Teferi style effect out. Bane of Progress, that's pretty obvious what that's for. It saves so many games against decks that Pillow Fort decks or Artifact decks. It just really kind of helps you catch up. And then Archetype of Endurance, obviously it's great against removal heavy decks and also against commanders. It's a little slow, but against commanders sometimes that are extremely difficult to deal with, like Sigarda or what's the other one I'm thinking? Oh, Earl the Mistwalker. Next column, basic answer spells, some light counter magic. Force of Will save your life so many times. Croson Grip is kind of a concession to counter magic decks and also Humility, where you can't rely on Rex Sage. Relic, another nod to Graveyard. And then finally, spells. Most of these, as I mentioned earlier, you do not want to be casting spells in an Animar deck. So in order to make this column, it has to be stupid powerful on its own. Ancestral Visions obviously is great. Card advantage, survival of the fittest. If you get that in under control decks, it's very difficult for them to deal with it, especially if they're playing colors that don't have enchantment removal. Sylvan Library, great source of card advantage. Birthing Pod is hugely underplayed in Commander. You can catch so many people off guard with what you grab. My favorite is birthing podding into Teferi, but at the time they realize what you're doing, they're locked out from interacting with you for the rest of your turn. Greater Good is essentially a combo piece. There are times you get this out, it stops steal effects, and also it just can cause some stupid turns where you're dropping huge colorless creatures. Cloudstone Curio, tons of value and can actually get you out of some very bizarre spots. And it can't, I guess it can go infinite, but it can also just generate huge chains of value. Lightning Greaves, obviously keeping Animar alive. And then Sword of Feast and Famine obviously can create a huge amount of mana while pressuring opponents' hands and getting through certain colored blockers. All in all, this is my deck. There are plenty of other things that come in and out of it. Terastodon is something I like a lot. Mainly got taken out because I kept playing against Bribery and Clone Effects, but right now, this is kind of how I like it, and we'll try and run through a few games and see how it goes.